I want to start by dedicating, wait a minute, let me find out if we are we taping and are we really ready? Or do I have to wait for somebody to give me a thumbs up? We don't know. I mean, I could tell you stories before we get started because, as you know, I'm always full of like 100 million jillion stories. But, you know, I did tell a couple of people that after I got dressed, I asked my husband, do I look okay? He said, yes. I said, okay, if Eric calls, that's our son, tell him I'm busy getting, dressed for church. Which I thought would be, ha 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 ha. But of course he knows that I often am here, and we are ready?
You are live.
Oh, I am live. Oh, all right. So we will stop talking about personal, stories. And instead, we will do this. I would like to dedicate this particular session to a young woman named Allie, who came to a class of mine many years ago and had already received an email from me because in those days, the university refused to let people go by the name that they wanted to go by. And so in those days, I made a practice of sending an email out 2 weeks before class and a week before class, just, if you have a different name than I have on my roster that I should be using, please let me know. And Allie was one of those people. So I am dedicating this session to Allie, whose amazing growth over the years that I knew her and the amazing struggle that she faced as a member of a family that had wholly rejected her was unfolding before me. And remembering how she became this tall, beautiful woman who was free. Women like Allie, and there are various kinds of people like Allie, I want to say, are the victims right now of a national onslaught that has been frightening people and horrifying and scaring people and forcing people to move out of the states that they're in for fear. It has led to increased bullying and increased suicide rates among trans youth. I would like to dedicate this session to our conscious awareness that we, again, whoever we are and however we identify, subscribe to the principle that says, love thy neighbor as thyself. May we all go out and meet with all human beings with that generosity, that tenderness, and that love that we are enjoined to live. And may we say, Amen. So, today I want to talk to you about gender complexity in the story of Joseph. And we're going to start with what am I saying when I use the word queer, right? Because people have all sorts of associations with that word. And I want to just make my definitions. I tell my students all the time, define your terms. If you don't define your terms, I don't know what you're talking about. So I'm going to define my terms. In this context, I am using it in the way that masculinity studies, queer studies, and feminist studies in my field, in religious studies, use that term. And that term, then, is not to be understood as referring to homosexuality per se, and in fact, there is no such thing as homosexuality in the ancient world. There are some other different interesting things, but homosexuality, as we understand it, is not one of them. That's a modern term developed in the late 1800s, and it has a very specific idea around object desire that is not quite how we can talk about the ancient world. That we can talk about some other time, though, if you want to get complicated. It is something in this context that is unsettling. Queer is understood as something that unsettles, that makes you go, that doesn't seem to be what I thought it was. That looks somehow different. Something definitely that will trouble biblical heteronormativity. And what I mean by that is the binary of this is what a man is, this is what a woman is, definitions that seem pretty straightforward to a world that we live in our binary dominated world, right? So when I'm using the word queer, I'm going to say that heteronormativity that we think is at work in the Hebrew Bible is going to get troubled by what we do. So, all right, I'm already going to put Debbie to work immediately, because before I start talking about this, I'd like to know what you know. If I were to say to you, what do you know about Joseph in relationship to Joseph's gender expression? Does anything pop up for anyone? And if nothing does, that's fine. If Debbie doesn't go anywhere, that's fine too. If you're all going, I don't know. Okay, Nancy has something. Yay.
Good luck.
Throat.
So my throat's screwed up, but can you hear me? So when I think about Joseph, I think about him as male.
Okay, so Nancy thinks about Joseph as a male character in the Hebrew Bible. All right, does everybody pretty much agree with that? Okay, so the gender indeterminacy, you're thinking, what is she talking about? Okay, in that case, Debbie, you didn't have much work to do. You get to sit down. So let's talk about what we do know. We know that Joseph is something of a daddy's boy, don't we? Right? He's a favorite. Everybody knows that. I had one like that. I had a son who, was with me most of the time in his youth, but when his dad came home from work and I went out with my baby in my arms at 6 months, Dad would get out of that old station wagon and he would go like they practically fall, so I had a daddy's boy. I know what that is. He wears unusual clothing. Do we remember that? That he has some kind of unusual clothing that his father made for him. Lodge that little point in your memory banks. He is described when we see him as a na'ar. A na'ar is generally, though not always, so this is a complicated thing in Hebrew Bible, right? But it's often used to describe a really, sort of teenage boy, right? Or even younger, a boy of, say, 8 or 9 or 10. And we know that when we actually meet him, he's already a young man, but he seems to be getting made younger than he really is. And his beauty, do we remember that? His beauty is a topic, right? Yes, Melissa. Okay, Debbie, hold on. Let's make sure. No, we want for the taping of this to make sure everybody gets heard.
I just had a aha moment. We're talking about a different Joseph than I thought we were. I thought we were talking about Jesus' father, Joseph.
Aha! Well, I want to say I am just not equipped there.
It's fine, I just went,
It's fine. Oh, different Joseph. That's hilarious. Though, I will think about it, and I will connect with the scholars I know who are in what we call the Greek Bible, as opposed to New Testament, Old Testament, and I will ask if anybody's had anything to say about that Joseph. All right, so now that we're back in this Joseph, wow, that is really funny. I'm going to go home and tell my husband, guess what? All right, so let's take a look at some things about Joseph, particularly the clothes that he wears. Here's the verse, Israel, that's the name of Jacob. Remember, he has 2 names. He's renamed after a struggle with a mysterious being in the night. Israel loved Joseph best of all his sons. Wow, you want sibling rivalry? Put out for you right away. Happens all through Hebrew Bible. For he was the child of his old age, and he had made him an ornamented tunic. Now, I want you to remember how Melissa spoke to issues of translation last week, because this is going to come up again and again and again. Here, this piece, the Ketonet Pasim, is translated as an ornamented tunic. Hold it and think about it. Because there's one other place where this garment shows up, and there it's not described as an ornamented tunic by any translator. She's wearing a long robe with sleeves, ketonet pasim. And how is this garment described? As the kind that princesses wear, that virgin daughters wear. She is wearing a garment fit for a princess, a ketonet pasim. Now that seems interesting, doesn't it? Because if we translated that in the previous verse, Joseph made him the garment for a virgin royal princess, every one of us would go, wait, what? Right? But we don't get that translation there, and that's important. What is really very important when you think about these two characters, Tamar of 2 Samuel 13 and Joseph of Genesis. Joseph, like Tamar, is also hated. Remember that after Amnon rapes Tamar, he loathes her. He hates her with a hatred that is repeated multiple times in one verse. Like 5 or 6 times the word hatred comes up. He loathes the woman he's raped, and then he doesn't even refer to her as a person. He tells his servant, get that out of my rooms, right? He completely dehumanizes her. Now, Joseph also is hated by his brothers, and he's wearing a garment that appears in another context to be made for young girls. And he's hated by his brothers. Are you having some associations? Yeah. Is there even the possibility that his brothers abused him? Well, they throw him in a pit, right? Now, we don't know what else, yes, that's right, Ken. What else is about that relationship that we don't know, right? There is definitely violence being used. They sell him into slavery. What happens to women who are victimized in both the ancient world and today's world? They are sold into slavery. They are put into forced marriages. We could go on and on. Right? We need to be thinking about this and asking ourselves to really take in the serious violence of the experience that Joseph endures. And remember, he's been described as beautiful. He's wearing a garment made by his father that seems to be a woman's clothing, and he's thrown into a pit and sold away. So already we should have some interesting associations. Okay. Everybody breathing? I said that Joseph's beauty was a topic. Now, I don't know if you can tell this, but literally the exact same words are used in this verse, right? Exactly the same. The only difference is that one is constructed male and one is constructed female in terms of the verb. He was beautiful to look at, she was beautiful to look at, but the words are exactly the same words. But note how they are translated. Do you notice anything about the translation? Say that nice and loud one more time.
They are now gendered.
You betcha. They are so gendered. One, to make sure that we are talking about male attributes, right? He's well-built and handsome. But it's exactly the same words. Yafa ta'ar ve'yafa mareh. Beautiful to look at, beautiful to see. Beautiful in appearance. Yafa means beautiful. I have a stuffed animal at home whose name is Yafa. Okay, so you should already be thinking, how interesting, right? That exactly the same phrase for Rachel, his mother, is showing up for Joseph, right? Now let's take a look at his body. In Genesis 43:30, we have this moment when Joseph is overcome because he's seen Benjamin, his brother, right? And he's so overcome with his feeling, he's on the verge of tears. He goes into a room and he weeps there. By the way, Joseph weeps a lot. And by the way, weeping before you jump to a conclusion there is not necessarily gendered in Hebrew Bible. David weeps, a lot of people weep, a lot of men weep. Weeping doesn't have quite the association in that world as it does with ours as being something men don't do, right? Men do weep in Hebrew Bible. Still, interestingly enough, what is translated here, he was overcome with feeling. Oh boy. Like I look at that and go, that was a good way to get around the actual language. You did a wonderful job, Mr. Translator. Or Ms. Or. Because what's actually being described here is a word, the source word is rechem. And that word, that source word, is womb. The rechem in biblical literature is the source of compassion. A woman's womb is the source of compassion. That's where we find compassion. Effectively, if I were to translate this more literally, I would say, his womb grew warm. Because the word that precedes womb means to grow hot or grow warm. His womb grew warm, or his compassion grew warm. Do you need to breathe? Because that seems unusual, right? That we would have this situation. So we have a motherly feeling, we have compassion. Literally, what is being described here is almost a female bodily organ that is responding. So we want to think about what we're meant to hear. Rather interestingly enough, if you take a look at where it is that we find the root rechem, it only appears 6 times in all of the book of Genesis, only 6 times. And 3 of these are related to the physical wombs of identified women, Leah, Rachel, and the women of Avimelech's household, when God shuts their wombs, right? Because Avimelech has Sarah in his possession. God, by the way, in Hebrew Bible, opens and closes wombs. God is responsible for when a woman gets pregnant. So in those 3 cases, right, definitely referring to the opening or closing of a womb. And the remaining 3 occurrences, each single one, is related to Joseph. In Genesis 43:14, when Jacob sends his sons, including Benjamin, to Egypt, he prays that the man, who he doesn't know, will have rachamim on them, will have womb-like compassion on them. So the father, Jacob, who made that nice dress for his son, is praying that the man down in Egypt, who he's hoping to get rations from, will have womb-like compassion for his sons. So that's one time. In Genesis 43:30, what we find here, Joseph's rechem, his rachamim, his compassion, is being activated upon seeing Benjamin. And finally, in Genesis 49:25, now everybody just breathe a moment. Jacob on his deathbed blesses Joseph with birchot shadayim v'racham. Birchot shadayim v'racham. The blessings of breasts and womb. Jacob blesses Joseph with the blessings of breasts and womb. Yes, Kathy. There's a reason your face is going, Because at this point, we got to ask ourselves, what does Jacob know about Joseph? Jacob has made his son what appears to be woman's dress. Jacob is blessing his son with breast and womb blessings. Does that seem a little surprising to you? Yeah, for good reason. Okay. So we've got all of these things going on. Just to make it clear, the idea of rachamim as belonging to God's compassion never occurs in Genesis. So we don't have that, like, if some of you are going, oh, rachamim has to do with God. It doesn't show up in the book of Genesis at all. It's not a concept there. So all we have in Genesis are these 6 occurrences, 3 about the women and 3 about Joseph. And I think that means we need to take that kind of seriously. So here's the only other place where we find something like this phrase around Rechem that we just saw, right, with Joseph when he has rachamim. Excuse me, let me go back here. So I'm comparing this, Genesis 43:30, with this. And why? What's going on in this story? The reading of Joseph's rachamim as a deep wave of physical and maternal kinds of love for his brother is supported by one other context where we see nichmeru rachamim in the entire Hebrew Bible, all the books of the Hebrew Bible. What you will know is Old Testament. In 1 Kings 3:26, we are again in this royal chamber. We're in the court of King Solomon. There are 2 women in disguise and in dispute, and each has given birth, and one of the babies dies. We remember this story, and one mother swapped it for the living child, and each accuses the other of doing this, and King Solomon famously calls for a sword in order to cut the child in 2. And at that moment, the true mother has exactly what Joseph had, that surge of maternal compassion, that exactly that thing, that rachamecha al bana, that's nichrumu, she has this. Exactly, her womb grows warm, and she says, don't do it, right? The true mother says, don't kill the child, because her womb has grown warm. Her womb has grown hot, just like Joseph's did. So that's the only other place in which we see this kind of expression. My ears are not big enough to hold these things. Now let's try that again. Okay. So, let's do a little bit of review. At this point, you've taken in a lot of information. He's got a feminine beauty just like his mother. Arguably, he's wearing a garment that's supposed to be worn by virgin princesses. He calls Benjamin my son, feels maternal and motherly feelings, almost appears to have a womb of his own that gets warm. And he's the only man in Genesis to have that kind of womb-like association. Okay? So where do we go from here? I want to talk to you about how people gave birth. How many of you here, by the way, are fans of Call the Midwife? Okay, so I only discovered this last year, this program, and while my husband was ill, and even we've been catching up on 10 years of this show. I'm not kidding. So I want you to hold that in your head, because some of you might remember an episode that I'm going to allude to later. But giving birth in the ancient world. Now, how many of you have read the series that was made also into a Netflix, The Handmaid's story? Yeah, something. Handmaid's Tale, thank you. Right. I actually read the book, didn't see the series. Sometimes people do that these days. And you might remember that there are scenes of, whoever the woman is who's giving birth is sort of leaning back on the body of the woman who is going to adopt the child, who the child will belong to. Do you remember that? At least they were in the book. That's taken directly from Hebrew Bible, and it's actually taken directly from the ancient Near East. So first, let's take a look at these moments. Consort with her that she may bear on my knees. That she may bear on my knees. That is exactly the ritual we are talking about. And the very same structural content here is described in Genesis 50 when Ephraim and the third generation here are likewise born on Joseph's knees. Okay? So now we're gonna parse this. We're gonna go step by step. What seems to be indicated here is something physical which has a social and legal consequence. And in one traditional birthing posture in the ancient Near East, we know that a laboring woman would lean back, brace herself against the body of another woman, while the midwife was positioned to catch the baby. And believe it or not, we've got an image from the ancient Near East. We've got a statue of this exact thing happening. Right? And what we understand about this is that this was done physically as a way to make clear that the child being born belonged to the woman who is supporting the woman who is giving birth. And so it's not even just an Israelite custom. This goes back a long time. You can see it. And there's the midwife who is helping deliver that child, right? And that is actually super important to think about because Joseph removes them from his knees, right? Is another verse where we're having this thing about knees going on, and knees are always referenced to the knees of women when it comes to the issue of birth, except for Joseph, right? In Job's grand lament, he wonders why he was born, why there were knees to push him from the womb, right? There is only this context behind the expression of Joseph's sons or his children being somehow born, somehow carried, somehow pushed from beneath his knees. By the way, there are a lot of people who will translate the his knees to refer to his father, Jacob, in order to get around this problem. So, because it feels like if you knew enough, you'd wonder why babies and children were coming from Joseph's knees. So I want to give you some potential readings here. Someone else might see Joseph as a cisgendered woman, plain and simple, and she lives her life in disguise. How many stories have you heard of women who lived their lives in disguise as men, right? They do that secretly in history. And the Israeli poet Nurit Zari makes exactly this move. She is Joseph. She's describing a girl who is forced to behave as if she were a boy so that Rachel will not end up disappointing her husband. She has to lie to everybody that she's actually birthed a boy because boys are what matter, right? She dresses her girl as a boy, and her girl has to act the role of a boy. And that's what this poet is suggesting, that we've got this kind of situation with Joseph going on endlessly her whole life long. She has to pretend. She has to figure out something, right? Some way to be. And in fact, I'm sure we've all heard stories of the women who've dressed up as men to avoid, presenting as women. There were women who actually dressed up as men and fought in the Confederate War, right? In the Civil War. So in the Confederate Army is what I meant to say there. Another possibility here, and this is where I want to refer to the story in one of the episodes of Call the Midwife, in which a young woman only discovers, she's kept secret for years and years and years from her mother, that she doesn't menstruate. She doesn't know why. And she's about to get married, and she has a physical examination, and she is found not to have any female parts. She manifests as completely female, except that internally she doesn't have a womb, she doesn't have ovaries, she has male sexual parts. And so this is an episode about the fact that she's intersex, but how does she identify? She identifies as female. Her husband accepts her, says, you know, I'm not marrying you because of a longing for children. We will work this out, right? And accepts her as a female. But she is, in fact, intersex. And this happens more often than you would think. 1 to 2 out of 100 women, 100 people in the United States will be born with intersex characteristics. Right? This is not as unusual as we would like to make it seem, and we would like to make it seem that way because we're so insistent on our binary assumptions about how bodies are made. And we need to kind of rethink that. So being intersex is a naturally occurring variation. This is not a medical problem. Medical interventions are not necessary, and it is possible that the rabbis are speaking to exactly this condition when they have a long kind of conversation about what they call the androgynos, right? Like, who is the person with various sexual parts, and, you know, may they marry, and how would they marry, and how would that work? And, you know, there are all sorts of, like, conversations about it in Talmud. So I want to say that's another possible reading, that somehow what's bleeding through the text here with these constant references to Joseph, which seem to emphasize a feminine aspect to his personality, are actually because Joseph was, in the imagination of the writer, an intersex individual, right? And that might be why we are seeing these kinds of texts. You know, do we have a woman whose body was normatively male? Do we have Ellie here? Right? Ellie was born biologically seen as male, but something in her, and that could have been all sorts of things that are inside her body, because no, it's not as simple as X, Y, or as we think it is. There are so many different ways that our chromosomes get together. And for her, the need to transition to become fully female as she could was a compelling one, right? Is that what we have in Joseph? Does Jacob know something about his son and his son's gender expression, and is therefore loving him anyway and helping him feel like himself with the kind of cloak, garment that he makes for him? All these things are possible. So was Joseph transgender? Maybe. This is a quote from Rabbi Erwin Keller, who was a student of mine. Though honestly, even as a student, he was my colleague. I'm glad of an ambiguous Joseph, a Joseph who doesn't fit in the binary and who is beyond the binary, a Joseph whose existence is an invitation for all sorts of queer people to see themselves reflected in Torah's stories, which too often are not fertile soil for our queer imagination. He also writes that he's come to include Joseph in a particular prayer called the Amidah, Avot ve'imahot, our ancestors, as neither patriarch nor matriarch, but holding the space of a transcestor, right? Assuring us that our lineage and our legacy as Jews will include figures whose gender is as elusive, and inclusive as our own. Thank you. I would like to acknowledge that Erwin's work on this topic was the inspiration for this presentation. He is one of the most tender, loving, amazing human beings I have ever met in my life, and he deserves the honor, the kavod, for helping me put this together. Thank you all. All right, it's time for questions or comments or reactions. Please do not be shy. Remember my adage, be shy in your own time.
Yes. So this is very interesting. Rabbis have been chewing on these texts for over 2,000 years, 3,000 years. And I'm just wondering how much before, like the last 20, 30, 40 years, were they seeing these things and asking questions, or is this just something that's come up lately?
What a beautiful question. Thank you so much. The rabbis notice these curiosities about Joseph. Not all of them, but most of them that I have mentioned can be found in rabbinic discussion. And one of their interesting commentaries has to do with whether Dinah and Joseph were switched in the womb of their mothers, of Leah and Rachel, right? That Leah was meant to have Joseph, Rachel was meant to have Dinah, a girl, right? So do they notice the beauty of Joseph? Yes. Do they notice the language that we see around compassion? Yes. Are they more likely to have conversations with at least the admission that something interesting is going on? I would say yes. Do they wholeheartedly step into the place that Rabbi Erwin Keller did with the figure of Joseph, and scholars have come to do? I would say no. But are they they don't have the vocabulary for it in the way that we do, right? But they are clearly identifying that something is up in these texts, and that it's an interesting, I would say, not anomaly, but a curiosity. And they do that with other characters too. Like, they talk about the fact that Yael, who is the woman who kills Sisera, that her name, Yael, means he went up. And they notice that there are male words being used about Yael, even male verb forms. So yeah, they know those texts, they know when it's odd. Do they have the same answers we do? Maybe not. I hope that's a good answer. Yeah. Okay, yeah, Melissa.
Okay, this kind of goes back to my question from last week about translation.
Mm-hmm.
How much of all of this amazingness that you just talked about is my understanding of the story based on the translation of it, that Joseph, male, et cetera, versus the actual Hebrew of it is that he was portrayed as, she was portrayed as male. And also, my second question is, and I think you alluded to it a little earlier, is why would they hide a girl as a boy?
Excellent. I'm going to take the second question first. Hiding a girl as a boy has been done for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, as far as we can tell. And this culture, even ancient Israelite culture, is going to value boys over girls. So, you know, there's plenty of evidence that there's more value placed on a boy chick than a girl chick, even in the agricultural and archaeological record, right? Women do not in the ancient Near East, as a rule, have the same kind of status as men across the board. So that would be a reason there. Okay, now the Hebrew, right? I tell my students, I used to do a mean joke on my students, you know, they'd all, you know, tumble into my biblical class and say, how many of you have read the Bible? Hands up. How many of you have read the whole Bible? Some hands still going up. And then I'd look at them and said, how many of you have read it in Hebrew? And Greek? No hand goes up. And I say, okay, sorry, no, you've read a translation. And it is by Professor James Kugel, describes what we all learn in our Sunday schools as the rewritten Bible, as the Bible that has been rewritten through translation, through agendas, through theological context, and presented to us. This, by the way, I want to make something really clear. This does not mean that the rewritten Bible you got has no value, right? Because we all interpret texts, don't we, right? And we all have agendas in how we interpret those texts. So, I know that there are texts that you will see as a clear prediction of the birth, the life, and the death of Jesus Christ in Hebrew Bible, and I will go, I can't see it in the Hebrew. Does this make your reading or what you are doing with it less capable of telling a truth for you? No. Aesop's fables, not a single one of them, I don't know about you, but I have not yet met up with talking, wolves and turtles and things like that. And hares. Do they still tell us moral truths or ethical truths or intellectual truths? They do. So stories that we have as part of our tradition are what I would call multivalent. They're capable of telling many, many truths, right? Many truths. So your translation is telling a different truth. My concern is that translators have predominantly relied, specifically around gender, on very binary readings of that Hebrew text, which, are less standard than we think. And because of that, they have locked out people who are belonging to the LGBTQ plus community. They've locked them out. Because if you translate the text and there's nothing but guys in this form and girls in that form, if you only read it that way, then you have made that textual tradition completely inaccessible to people who belong to the LGBTQ plus community. And we know what that's meant. That's meant bullying, that's meant harassment, that's been depression, that's been suicide. That means human beings are not permitted a doorway in. And when you actually look at those texts, oh, wait, there are some doorways. And we should find them. We should look for them. I hope that was a decent answer. Okay. Other thoughts? We've got one way back there, Debbie. Thank you. I'm relying on her.